Welcome to Wine Soundtrack USA. Listen to the passion with which producers narrate their winery and their world. In 30 answers, discover their stories, personalities, and passions.
Hello, friends and listeners of Wine Soundtrack. This is Allison Levine, and today I am in the Napa Valley with Lindsay Hoopes of Hoopes Vineyard. Lindsay, welcome to Wine Soundtrack, and tell us, we're sitting in the middle of this beautiful property with lots of livestock and different animals. Tell us about Hoopes Vineyard.
Well, thank you so much, Allison. It's an honor to speak to your listenership. I'm not sure if that's a word, but thank you, everybody. We are indeed sitting at our newest property, which is the Oasis by Hoopes. The Hoopes family has been in the wine business, primarily in farming, since the early 1980s. And we have our sort of flagship property about 7 minutes from where you and I are today. But we ended up purchasing this property in 2017 so that we could put in a huge organic garden, our animal sanctuary, and also invite people to sort of remember the early years of agriculture in Napa Valley. So as a younger winemaker, I guess, or younger vintner, at least with respect to the age of most of the proprietors, I also have lived in Napa Valley since the early 1980s and remember the kind of sleepy agricultural town that I fell in love with as a child. And I really wanted to remind people that first and foremost, wine is an agricultural product. And you can have a lot of luxury, if you will, and the beauty of Napa Valley while you sort of embrace that agricultural foundation. And so the Oasis was built on that premise that, you know, Napa was sort of a world away of the hustle and bustle because of the agricultural preserve. It remains away from the hustle and bustle.
Sure.
But I think a lot of times people think of Napa Valley as synonymous with these beautiful marble mausoleums or very large corporate entities. And they certainly exist, but there is a coexistence of the small family farm. And we are that, the truly authentic family-owned multi-generational business. So.
I love it. So you have two properties. What's your total acreage and what are you growing on there? What grapes?
We actually grow primarily Cabernet Sauvignon. We've actually been growing primarily Cabernet Sauvignon since the early 1980s and have the oldest Cabernet vineyards in Napa in their original form. And those are located in Oakville. So if you drive to that property, it is immediately noticeable that they are just hearkening back to the early years of agriculture here in Napa. I would say that here at the Oasis property, I did not actually plant this vineyard. We are doing some things to kind of improve the soil series, and that was one of the reasons that we introduced regenerative farming and one of the reasons that we introduced animal husbandry and also other crops because we wanted to create biodiversity. But as it stands now, here we have a little bit of Malbec, a little bit of Merlot, a little bit of Petit Syrah, a little bit of Petit Verdot, and a little bit of Cabernet as well. So it's kind of a field blend, and it was a little bit of a, kind of an interesting take by the previous owner. And so we are coming in to kind of improve it. Our first harvest here was in 2017, and we actually, in 2017, we lost that harvest, so we were not able to produce from it. And before we changed any of the plantings, we really wanted to get a feel for what the wine in the current state was quality-wise. And so we didn't end up getting to practice in 2017, but in 2018 we did.
And the total acreage?
Oh, I'm sorry. The total acreage between the two properties is going to be, I think it's 22 acres. And then we have additional acreage under vine in long-term leases. So we took some of those old grapevines from our Oakville property and budded them over behind us to basically succession plan. And we took our 3 favorite Cabernet clones. They're all suitcase clones.
Wow. So. And are you exclusively estate fruit or do you source from any other vineyards?
We do source from some vineyards. It really depends on what our lineup is. One of my goals when I came back into the business was to sort of tell our family story. I had done, I guess, a tour of duty at a large winery estate so that I could really learn about the business, learn about distribution, and that actually essentially pushed me out of the industry altogether. I thought that I didn't like wine because I didn't like big wine. And that just wasn't, I needed to sell something that has a sense of place, something that had sort of the story or the vision that my father brought to Napa Valley as part of it. And he wasn't ready to hire me, so I ended up moving on to a legal career and only came back to help him when his health was deteriorating. And at that point in time, I sort of rejuvenated my love for the wine industry because I really, I realized that I was passionate about wine. I was passionate about the story of the families.
Right.
And so when we brought new people on board for the winemaking team, because my father had grown ill, it was important for me also to tell their story through wine. And so when I was working with Jennifer Rue and Ann Vauder, who made our wine up until the 2018 vintage, I wanted them to tell me about some vineyards that had really helped them develop their careers and some grape varietals, for example, that they found maybe underappreciated in Napa Valley or that they had access to that really helped form them as, winemakers in their current state, if you will.
Yeah.
So our wine told our story already, but we needed to weave in the story of all of the important people, and winemakers, in my opinion, are certainly a large component of that. So we do source fruit for some of our small ultra premium products that represent varietals that we do not really grow.
Okay. And what is your total case production?
So right now, our case production on most of our Hoopes wines is below 10,000 cases. So our Hoopes Napa Valley is our largest volume product, and that's around half of that. And then everything else is, 150 cases, 1,000 cases, 500 cases, something like that.
And where are your wines available? Are they exclusively direct to consumer? Can you ship across the country, or are you available in any markets?
We actually are available DTC, so the best way to find us if you're outside the local area is to go online. As most small producers will probably tell you, at any given snapshot in time, because we don't distribute as corporately as many other wines that you see in supermarkets or retail locations, we sell to small mom and pop shops, and we sell to small restaurants. And of course, those entities have been the hardest hit during COVID as well. So it's difficult with my magic wand to tell you how easy it is to get in your market. We do have representation in a lot of markets, and we are trying to increase that. But it is a large task for a mother under 4 who also, I have 2 kids under 4, and I run all of these, this facility, which has tons of animals. So it's really difficult to, it requires me to get on the road, go into each market, and really sell the wines door to door. And so even when we have the help of distributors, we are not a big engine. And the best way to support us is to buy online. But we do, because of my legal background, have registrations in every state, more or less, where we can ship. And we make it very easy for you.
Wow. Super easy. So now, before we jump back into your wine, I want to talk to you as a wine drinker. You said that you grew up here in Napa Valley and you have lots of memories, of the old Napa Valley. But I'm wondering, what is your first memory relevant to wine?
Wow. I think the strongest memory that I have, certainly this was not my first memory of trying wine, but my father was a farmer from 1981 until 1999, almost exclusively for other people. And because we had the only vineyards that survived the phylloxera outbreak, and we were producing for quite a few other of the renowned Oakville wines that became the cult sort of history of Napa Valley, my father was approached by winemakers who wanted to use his name as a single vineyard designate. And at that point in time, he said, well, if somebody thinks my name is worth a darn putting on a bottle of wine, I should do it myself. And at that point in time, that was sort of when we made the transition from farming only to winemaking. And, in my sort of teenage haze, if you will, I poo-pooed the farming side of it. And I always thought, why are we doing all the hard work and then everyone else is taking the glory, and nobody wants to be a farmer. Everybody wants to be like a winemaker. That's so much cooler. And so I left Napa for high school and college and swore I was never going to come back because that was just not, we weren't cool. And even though Napa was maybe getting cooler, you have to remember when I was growing up in Napa, we had 81 people in Oakville. We had, it was a tiny, tiny community.
Yeah.
And so that just felt sleepy and boring, and we weren't the cool kids. So in any event, when my father made that transition, we actually were able to drink his first bottle of wine under his name at my 21st birthday. So that was like a big, it was like it marked a transition for our family into winemaking. It marked a transition for me into, I guess, legally drinking. But, just as far as that was a big moment for me. And it was really fun to share that with, my parents over our sort of family first bottle of wine. So
that's beautiful. So that's a very memorable occasion and a memorable wine. But in all the wines you've tasted, did you ever have a wine that was one of those aha moments? Maybe the wine that set you back into the wine industry or had initially turned you on to wine that made you look at it and say, I love to drink it, or I want to make it, or, something separate from the farming side of it, but just those aha moments in wine?
My aha moment was a little bit sort of, I proved myself wrong, or I don't know, like history kind of proved me wrong. So I think that I've always really appreciated wine, and I've always appreciated very great wine. And my father, despite having zero family exposure to wine, really grew up as Napa grew up. And so we were exposed to this dynamic region, and he was exposed to a lot of amazing wines, and he developed a passion for it. But an uneducated passion in a sense, because he was very self-taught, and he just had an amazing palate. And he invested not in California wines because he couldn't figure out, he never thought that they would ever really take off. He always thought that, he was really getting into wine, but he thought French wines were still the wines to kind of invest in. And so he purchased a bunch of 1982s and 1981s, so around my birth year. And I always, for one, he kept telling me that 1981 was a terrible vintage, and why was I born in that year? Because that's why he had collected so heavily. And, things were actually affordable at that time. So I know it wasn't super heavily, but in any event. So lo and behold, I ended up kind of telling him my birth year was his fault, but hey, good thing I was close to 1982 because he invested in that as well. But I've always been a little bit reticent to believe in the kind of premier vintages, especially when it comes to Napa Valley. I just think that sometimes they get over-bloated, overinflated, and a lot of lesser-known vintages kind of get looked by the wayside and provide a lot of really interesting flavors and dynamicism that they don't get credit for. And so people in the United States don't really shop vintage to vintage the way that they shop Bordeaux's vintage to vintage. But I was like, is there really that big of a difference between 81 and 82? And my whole life, I'd kind of lived this, sort of impression that there's no way 82 really stands out and is that special. Until I actually, when my father almost passed away, he sold off essentially his entire wine collection, but he kept a couple bottles and he dropped them off. And I thought they were samples. I didn't even look in the box. But as I did open the box eventually, I noticed that they were 1982 Chateau Latours in Magnum. And I was like, oh, okay. So I belonged to a wine club in Washington, D.C. at the time, and I decided that I was, we always brought a bottle. And I was like, my dad spent his whole life saving all of these amazing wines that he never really got to enjoy. So I made a promise to myself that I wasn't going to let things sit around and just not open them when any opportunity essentially, arose. And so I took the 1982 to basically a cookout, and everyone thought I was joking. They were like, really? You're bringing like a fancy bottle of wine? Haha, she's probably bringing hoops. And of course I brought this 1982 Chateau Latour, and it was actually as amazing as everyone said. And it was the best bottle of wine I ever had, which is hard for a Napa winemaker to sort of admit. Equally hard, I think, for them to admit, but,
Absolutely. Wow. So if we come into your home today and into your wine cellar or your wine collection or the few bottles under your bed or wherever you keep it, what would we find in there? Is it mostly Napa today, or, a nice smattering from around the world, or what would we find?
To be honest, you'd find definitely mostly Hoopes. The last trip I took before COVID and before my second was born was in Italy, and we actually toured in Tuscany, and we found quite a few interesting little, like Lake Chiusa, actually. We went to have a dinner there, and we ended up buying a lot of that. So I would say I love big Italian reds. And we had a big tour with Gaia, and so she introduced me to a lot of her favorites. So that's sort of what you might find as remnants. But to be honest with you, I've been pregnant most of the time and or nursing with 2 babies under 4. So I just I have really let my own personal collection go. If we need wine, we've got Hoopes. Otherwise, we get what we get through trades, and we end up with whatever it is. So
was there anything you opened recently on a night that you weren't taking care of the kids that drank really well?
Wow. Well, I would say that we just switched winemakers. COVID had sort of an interesting challenge presented for us. Anne Vauder was actually stuck in New Zealand, and she's been our winemaker since 2012. And I never really contemplated building a team without her. So it was a little bit strange that COVID sort of brought these unanticipated surprises. Sure. And in any event, I ended up bringing on to the team Aaron Pott, who's fantastic. We interviewed quite a few people, and really the decision was based on his love for organic farming and his passion for what we're doing here in the Oasis in particular, but also at both of our properties. And so we just really gelled and aligned on a number of things. And we produced our first wine together in the 2020 Chardonnays that we produced. So I think for me, it was actually, no, this is
not the one I have right here.
No, it's not the one you have right here. I will go see if I can find it. But I think for me, it was really fun because it was the first time somebody else had made wine from that vintage since I took over. And so it's a totally different expression of a similar or nostalgic expression.
Absolutely. So tell me something. Do you think there's a such thing as a perfect variety?
If there were one, I mean, I really do think from a farming perspective, because that's, to be honest with you, most of my experience. I think that Cabernet, when you have the right climate, is sort of the perfect grape in so many ways, because it has this incredible nuance, and it has, it's extraordinarily robust. And of course, because that's the grape that I grew up sort of growing, that is what home is to me. So, sure. I mean, that has, I'm sure, a huge influence. But I think that, it is... in Napa, just performs so much better than anywhere else I've seen it in the world. And so for Napa, for me, for our vineyards, Cabernet is perfection.
And what is your opinion on wine critics and scores?
I think that for the longest time, you had the influence over consumership and also success for the industry isolated in a very small few number of people. And so in some respects, I mean, I think it helped consumers navigate what can be a very intimidating world. And so from that perspective, I don't think it was a bad thing that people came up with the idea of, okay, let's make this a little bit more manageable, chewable for the average consumer. Let's create a point system. But I think what happened is people became overly reliant on a very small number of palates and didn't really realize that most of the fun in winemaking is sort of building your own adventure. Like the more you try, the more you figure out what your tastes are. My taste might be different than your taste, even though we have equally evolved tastes. And it's just like anything else, consumers, bring different preferences to the table with food. Why don't we realize that it's okay to be playful and try new things in wine? Right. For some reason, it sort of set this expectation like there's one right answer. There's 4 wines you should buy. And I think that that's just intimidated people into thinking that they have a lack of choice and a lack of sort of ability to think through their own purchases. So I think now, because of so many social media platforms and just access to different kinds of media, that more people have a voice. That in turn has made the space really loud and noisy. Like, who do you follow? Who's right? Who's wrong? And there really is no right or wrong. Right. I always tell people, find somebody whose palate you respect. And then, that gives you a good gauge of what to buy. But don't overlook, Napa in particular. I mean, one of the great things about Napa is it's a very small prime wine growing region. And so the level of differentiation between neighbor to neighbor, we say it's enormous because for us in this small myopic world, it is. But in reality, everybody makes really good wine in Napa. So if you go to a list and there's a name that is a great value that you've never heard before, try it. I mean, and I get that. I guess to say that people will go to restaurants and order things off the menu they haven't tried before. I would love to see them start doing that with wine.
Well, let's talk about different palates and preferences and yours. Quick answer, if you can do it. Red, white, or rosé?
Red.
Still or sparkling?
Still.
Ooh, see, simple. So how do you approach food and wine pairing? I mean, obviously, you're growing a lot of Cabernet. That's kind of your love, but you drink other things. Do you find that there are rules to follow? Do you have any rules that you use? Or do you just say, hey, I want to drink this wine and, if it works, it works. If I'll try it out.
I would say for people sort of engaging in wanting to learn more about food and wine, I like to think about wine as just another spice in your spice cabinet. And so when you are sort of thinking about what is the quote unquote right thing to pair with food, remember that different wines will pair with the same dish. They might just extract or accentuate different aspects of that dish. So there isn't one right answer. There are some convenient rules of thumb as you're getting accustomed or comfortable in this world that I think are completely appropriate to follow. But I would say that, there are no rules. And part of the fun is mixing and matching and seeing what you like. For me, I don't think Cabernet is as hard to pair with food, but I definitely think that there are some reds that are very underappreciated. So like Syrahs, Merlots, a number of those wines, we do make them. And I encourage people to think outside the box when they're buying Napa wines, because Cabernet isn't the only thing that we produce up here.
Well, so for somebody who hasn't had the pleasure to try your wines yet, what do you think they're missing out on?
A lot.
I know. Well, you touched a little bit when you were, at the beginning where you talked about that it's, a family farm and hearkening back, but, add on that.
I would say that we definitely make wine that is sensual. I think it tells a really important story. I know a lot of people speak about terroir and it feels potentially overused in the industry, but when I say it, I mean that we are talking about the vineyards that my father planted and that we farm and that we convert into products. So for me, it's very much a story of our family and a story of a really beautiful, interesting, multi-generational legacy in Napa. So if you don't try our wines, I think you're missing out on supporting family business that grew grapes and helped prop up the Napa industry for a very long time. People built their brands off of our wines. And so I think we provide a really great sort of look at those same grapes, but at a much more affordable price point, generally speaking. We are a female run and operated winery. So I love to think, and I've heard this before, that I think that we want our wine to complement the experience, the food, the friendships, the collaboration, whatever you're enjoying the wine with. And so I have found that everything is really very balanced. There's nothing that sticks out like a sore thumb, like, tannins or this, that, and the other thing. So anyway.
Beautiful. So if space aliens were to land on your property right now, they're welcomed by Caesar the big turkey here. Which of your wines would you want to welcome them with?
Of course, the wine I celebrated with my 21st birthday. We still make that wine from the original old vineyard. And, that's the clearest example of this is who we are.
And that is
Well, we are in the 2015 vintage, but if we wanted to take them on a history tour, we could go back to the 1999 vintage, which was my father's first vintage of that same vineyard. And then my first vintage was the 2012 of our Oakville. So it's the Oakville Cabernet, and we do go back to the 1999 vintage.
Wow. Making a whole history lesson and a welcome. So speaking of history and going back, we know that each vintage tells a different story. How much variation do you see from year to year, or do you see a lot of things repeating themselves? Like when you open up a 1999 Oakville Cabernet, and then you open up the 2012, and then you open up the 2015, how much variation do you credit towards what the vintage gave you?
I think as farmers, we're pretty acutely sort of connected with the difference in vintage because we do have to take different steps. We have to do different things. And so we probably notice vintage maybe a little bit more than other people consuming our single vineyard wine. And I do always tell people that vintage buying, of course, was an expectation set in, generally speaking, in buying Bordeaux wines, which is justified, quite frankly, in France because they don't have the consistency in weather. So vintages really do vary in quality. And of course, the quality of production in France has changed dramatically with influence from the United States. But, they were really sort of, I don't want to say loosey-goosey, but in making great wine, they didn't always have the sort of sanitation protocols, et cetera, that they learned from the United States. And so you got some funky differences year to year. And here in Napa, really, vintage to vintage, you're always going to get, with pretty minimal exception, excellent quality. So it's tough, but I notice it, and we talk about it in our marketing materials because people still talk about wines that way. But I don't think that most consumers should necessarily feel like they need to understand or see a difference or get caught up in it, because I don't know that it's going to really change their experience.
Right, not that extreme. So now we're here on a lovely property. We've got the vineyards in front of us. You've got this animal sanctuary with goats and miniature horses and turkeys and chickens and pigs and the cutest little piglets ever. So I'm sure you go in there and talk to all of your animals. I was in there talking to them earlier, so it's hard not to. But do you go into the vineyards and talk to your vines?
No. We buried the dog mascot, if you will, on the label is Dante, and he was, I joke, my father's favorite child. So he is buried in a section of our old vine vineyard, and we, I talked to him.
You talked to him.
And I talked to my mom. She's now out there too, so.
But yeah, in with nature. So, when you were little, what did you want to be when you grew up? I mean, you had told us what you ended up doing, but did you originally have an idea that you wanted to do this, or did you have a completely different direction you thought you would do when you were a kid?
Totally different. I wanted nothing to do with staying in farming, and I personally wanted to be a spy. And when I was rejected from that job application, I actually went to Georgetown. I speak 4 languages. I mean, I sort of have primed my life to be able to go into the CIA or some equivalent entity. And I was turned down, and I became a trial attorney. So I became a homicide prosecutor.
Wow. So many questions I can ask there. But I'm curious, what do you like to do in your free time when you're not working? You're like homicide investigations.
A little bit. I definitely really missed that job. I didn't leave because I didn't like it. I was a particularly dynamic career. I was in the cold hit division. I moved down to San Francisco, and I worked for a little known DA at the time named Kamala Harris. I mean, this was a crazy, sort of exciting job for a first-year law student or a first-year law grad, basically. And, I kind of thought, oh, wow, how could anything be more exciting and interesting than this? I don't need to go back to, the farm.
Right.
I think I've created another universe that works so well for my family. I don't think it's better or worse. It's just completely different, and it suits kind of my ability to support our legacy in Napa Valley, and also seems a little bit more appropriate for my family at this time. But I do, because of that, love to get involved in legal work. I'm on the executive committee for Save the Family Farms. I've found ways to use my legal sort of experience in ways that now help the community here.
And so between that and your kids playing here on the farm, you probably don't have much more time. But should you have a little free time to plan a romantic evening for you and your husband, what sort of wines would you open to set the mood?
I really probably Italian reds, because as I mentioned before, our second was born. We went to Tuscany. We also, one of our favorite trips was in Puglia. And I can't say that I was, overwhelmingly excited by all the wines that we tried there, but I think just the memories as I always say, wine tastes better when you're traveling, as a lot of people do, because, you're in vacation mode and you are soaking in all of the beauty around you. And I just feel like Italy has been one of those places for us. So as kind of canned as that maybe feels, that's just where we've been able to it's where he first said, I love you.
Oh.
We hung out in Puglia, it just means
So
a
you
lot.
open up some Italian wine and you go back into time and set that romantic mood. I love it.
Yeah. Now in PJs, looking at all the dinosaurs on the floor, going like, what were we thinking? How do we get back there?
So, growing up on the farm, and I'm sure your dad had lots of words of advice to share over the years, but is there one piece of advice that he or maybe someone else gave you, or maybe in law school or somewhere, that is a piece of advice you like to try to live your life by or approach your work through?
There's so many. That's a really, really tough question. I think in life, flexibility has been, I think, the most important thing, because there are so many aspects of personal life, business life that are actually out of your control. And you can plan for so many things, but you have to be ready for all of them not to come to fruition. And, flexibility isn't going to help us necessarily, or it's not going to prevent us from having to mourn or from losing or going through really tough patches with business. What flexibility does is it helps us resiliently get through those in a much more positive way. And so, and I think that that's true, honestly, for so many aspects of life in general, especially, with COVID. Look, we had to be flexible about how we thought about the wine industry, how we thought about operating our businesses. And the people who were most successful, I think, even if it was just mentally getting through COVID, were the ones that accepted change. And I also, I encourage my community members in Napa to remember that nothing stays static, right? So nothing stays static, and we have to accept that things are going to change. So the best way to be the shepherds of positive change is to be the change you would like to see and get involved so that your community around you is the community that you would like to live in. And the only way to do that is to stay flexible and say, I know things are going to change, so let me guide how that's going to happen.
Ooh, beautifully said. So when you look back at your career to date, because I know your kids are probably the answer otherwise, what would you say is one of your proudest achievements?
Pulling it off at all. I transitioned from homicide prosecutor to business owner, and two completely different worlds, different professional networks. I basically started all over, and I started from scratch. My father was in a coma when I took over the business. People hear that I'm a multi-generational business and sort of think, oh, it's easy, you step in. And I will say that family business is one of the most complicated things, but I also didn't really step into the business that I have today. I stepped into a primarily farming business that I transitioned because I promised myself to build something I believed in. And so, I think now being able to sit here with you and hear your excitement about my dream, for a long time it was just a dream. So now getting that feedback that people actually really like it, that they embrace it, all of those things is, I guess, my biggest accomplishment.
Beautiful. Beautiful. So complete this sentence for me. A table without wine is like?
Boring.
And now I want you to imagine a situation. We're sitting around a table and we've got the Hoopes Vineyard wines on the table. Maybe we have your Oakville Cabernet, and there's an empty seat at the table. Who's one person, living or deceased, from any walk of life that you wish you could see drinking Hoopes Vineyards that you'd want to share a bottle with?
This changes for me because there's so many people that I would love to invite over a glass of wine, but I can absolutely say that right now, it is Kamala Harris, because I started my first career with her, got the call. She invited me to come join her team at the DA's office. And I would love to sit with a glass of wine and just go over what's happened in the last,
she became
years.
The first female vice president of the United States, and you became a farmer with pet pigs.
Like, whoa, stuff changes, right? So I'd kind of love to like go over our old stories and kind of those memories and see, you know, I mean, at the end of the day, I've known her for a long time. And so I think just to reflect on what happened for the last 20 years, it's crazy.
Amazing. And maybe you could do a vertical so you could reflect on how the wine has changed.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We'll see if we aged better than the wine, because I tend to think we might have.
Well, I hope you've aged better than the wine, but I hope that also means that the wine aged beautifully as well.
Oh, shucks.
So if you were being sent off, if it was all over and you were being sent off to a deserted island and could take 3 wines with you, which 3 wines would it be? Any 3 wines?
Those that I told you, I think the 1982 Chateau Latour, and then probably the 1999, which was my father's first vintage, and the 2012, which is my first vintage. And hopefully the third at some point when my kids are old enough to appreciate and start getting involved in the business, maybe the first vintage of their wine would be the third if you know, I don't have to go to the island today.
Right. It all brings it back home. It's all about home and family. Well, we're almost finished, but we play our little game now where we pair wine with food, with music, you know, because wine conjures up such emotions in us. And you were talking about, you know, how you felt in Italy drinking wine and the sensations, and we're sitting here in a farm drinking a lovely Chardonnay, but music also makes us feel that way. So based on some of the wines that you make, if you can just tell me what it makes you think of, genre-wise or specific song, that's up to you. But right now, I've got a glass of the Jenny Chardonnay, and so what do you think?
Right now, for whatever reason, it's, you know, May is Mother's Day, and it's also happens to be my mother's birthday, and she passed away a couple years ago. But for whatever reason, I've been thinking a lot about the little old lady from Pasadena. Don't know why, but the reason that I love this particular wine, the 2014, is that a lot of people in Napa don't age wines anymore, age white wines. And my father used to age them all the time. And of course, in Europe, it's quite a common practice for a number of, you know, producers. And so for me, I think it's kind of a practice that's underappreciated. And what I've noticed is you get this like really beautiful caramelization. And so anyway, my mother was from Pasadena, and I think of like her having improved with age, and
a little, you know,
aged Chardonnay and
an old song from, you know, Beach Boys, a little.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, why not?
Yeah, why not? It's a fun time, and you know, you can enjoy your sort of old age too.
So you mentioned, well, what we have here, this is the 2016 Hoopes Cabernet.
That's the Oakville Cabernet.
Oakville Cabernet. So in general, the Oakville Cabernet, since, you know, it is such a important wine to your family.
What about it? I'm sorry?
What would you pair with it?
Oh, gosh.
Oh, you don't get off with just one wine.
Oh, wow. I guess. So funny you asked this, because I feel like once you have young kids, you really don't listen to music anymore. I feel like I have Cocomelon.
If you want to say that it reminds you of Baby Shark, that's fine.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, I feel like those are the only songs that come to mind, because I have completely lost all control over the television and over the radio. And so I listen to a lot of Hungry Caterpillar and you name it. But I think a couple of my favorite songs, what is that? Portishead. Glory Box is one of my favorite songs. And so that wine came out around the time that song was really popular. And so for whatever reason, I feel like if I wanted to get into it, like that's what I'd play.
Well, I won't put much pressure on you there, because we did do sort of your favorite wine, you know, the iconic wine, your dad's first wine. So I won't pressure you to do any more from that, especially since, you know, baby songs might not resonate with wine.
Whatever was popular the year I was born, because that wine is almost my age, right? So that would be a relevant baby song for that.
Well, Lindsay, we're almost finished. I've got one more question with a 2-part answer. The first part is, what wine region in the world is at the top of your wine list that you would love to go explore?
I've been very fortunate to go to quite a few, but I would love to go right now, you know, to Greece or Georgia, some of these places that have very old winemaking traditions, but I think access to their wines is so few and far between that it's really hard to get a feel for the industry there. Right. Living, in a remote place. I feel like we have a lot of access to France. We have a lot of access to Italy, South America, Australia, but Greece and Georgia. I've met somebody recently from Georgia who used to play for the Golden State Warriors. He's been a big fan of our wine for a while, and I didn't know this, but he and I were both on an ABC special, and Zaza Pachulia was explaining that his family has a long-standing tradition of winemaking in Georgia. And so I said, well, I would love to go with you because they also make brandy, and we've moved into making brandy here. So I thought it'd be really cool to kind of go see his family heritage just because I know him and he brought it up. So
that's fantastic. Well, I think that would be a wonderful trip. I'd love to go to Georgia too, but to see old family history when you're also sharing old family history here. So on that note, the second part of the question is, if people want to come visit you, how can they visit you, and what's available to them? What do they experience when they come here?
Thank you. So we are open. I don't want to get into too much legalese because Napa is a little bit confusing to even the best consumer. So I'm just going to say that the best way to visit would be to make an appointment. You can go online, and especially because of COVID, it's a little bit challenging to figure out what's open, what's not, and we can give you more information. But you can always come and buy all of our wines available here and enjoy them on the property. So, give us a call, info@hoopesvineyard.com or 707-944-1869. Or you can just email anything at Hoopes Vineyard. It comes my way, and we will, absolutely welcome you with open arms. And you can either enjoy your wine outside. We did come up with our mini to-go caddy. So we make all of our wines in 187 size format bottles, and we created a to-go caddy that allows you to take these to go for a perfect picnic. And this also gives you the ability to taste through a lot of wines if you don't want to buy anything by bottle.
That's fantastic. Well, it's really beautiful here. And if you get a chance, definitely stop by Hoopes Vineyard if you're heading to Napa, because you sit outside, you can look at the vineyards, the garden, and you can even wave at the animals. Caesar the turkey loves people. The little piglets love people. All the animals were friendly. So bring the kids and come see the animals and drink good wine.
That was a way better explanation. Yes. I forgot to mention, we do have obviously the animal sanctuary, so you can come meet the animals. We have over 90 chickens. We have 7 goats. We have Oasis, the donkey. We have lots of pigs, so it's really fun. It's very family oriented, and it's very agricultural oriented. So you can always, if you see members of our gardening team kind of wandering around the property, then they can answer any questions about what we do. We do have a big organic farmers market, so we sell our eggs, we sell our produce, and throughout the summer, if you're looking for somewhere to get the best produce anywhere, just come on by.
Well, Lindsay, thank you so much for joining us on Wine Soundtrack. It's been wonderful chatting with you, and cheers.
Cheers. Thanks for taking the time.
Anytime.
Thanks for listening to a new episode of Wine Soundtrack USA. For details and updates, visit our website, winesoundtrack.com.